Hi, I'm Dr. Rene Hackney. Welcome to Week 4, Part 1 of 8 Weeks to Positive Discipline. In this segment, we're going to be talking about natural consequences. This is what just might happen if the child continues that behavior. As a review, we've already covered several of the steps of positive discipline. iMessages, empathy, and positive intent were foundation steps. iMessages and empathy were to manage emotions and to calm the situation and to keep the communication open. Positive intent, how we think about their behavior. It shifts the feeling. Choices, challenges, and contribution were the active steps, ways to get behavior change started. And consequence language, what we're covering today, natural consequences, logical positive and logical negative consequences, these are your endpoint in the discipline process. The idea with natural consequences, logical positive and logical negative, is you're curbing behavior, but in different ways. The good thing to recognize here before we dive in is that for almost every behavior children do, all three of these are available. Natural, what just might happen, if you don't wear a coat, you might be cold. Logical positive, if the good behavior, the good related outcome, if you get your coat on quick, we can have more time to play. Logical negative, if the bad behavior, the bad related outcome, if you don't put your coat on, we're staying inside. I'm going to go through all of these and talk about the details, talk about how they work and why you might want to use one over the other. Starting with natural consequences. Again, these are what just might happen if the child continues that behavior. If you go out in the rain, you might get wet. If you don't wear a coat, you might be cold. If you don't do your homework, you might get a bad grade. The beauty of these is we're not the bad guy. We're not making them lose a turn. We're not taking a toy. We're not making them sit out. Life is the bad guy. You're just warning the child. You're letting them know, if you choose this behavior, here's what might happen. The downside, and there's a couple here, is these don't kick in until about 3.5 years old. When you say to a 2-year-old, if you don't wear a coat, you might be cold, most of them go, okay. They don't have it. They don't remember the last time they were cold. They're not pulling together that future consequence. They don't have a good future tense yet. But somewhere by about 3.5 toward 4 years old, these really do kick in. And when you say, wow, if you don't eat right now, you might be really hungry later, they should remember being hungry. It should start to curb that behavior. And so the idea here is you're stating it, but these really don't kick in for most kids to be meaningful until about 3.5 years old. I say these things to younger children. Let's say you've got a 2-year-old climbing on the bookshelf. I say, oh honey, you might get hurt. But it's as I'm taking them down. I'm not letting them weigh their options about getting hurt at 2 years old. So you might say them. I just don't want you to expect them to be very effective with really young children. Once a parent has stated a natural consequence, part of the hard part for parents is letting the child then experience some of that consequence if they choose the behavior. Let's say I've got a 4-year-old at the front door and they're arguing with me about wearing a coat and it is, 26 degrees outside. And I finally go, if you go out like that, you might be really cold. And they say, fine. And you go, fine. And you open the door. If the second the cold air hits them, you put the coat on them, you're going to have that battle again tomorrow. I am not saying freeze your children. Take the coat with you. But let them get cold. Let them get out into the yard and feel the cold. Them feeling the cold is what helps to curb that behavior today and that argument tomorrow. I have had parents say, we leave the coat home. 8 hours later, they're an ice cube. That's not it either. They're not thinking 8 hours from now and appreciating needing a coat. That take the coat with you, but let them feel the cold is the idea. Let's say you've said to a child, if you leave your toys out, they might get lost or broken. And then a day or two later, find them crying. One of their favorite toys that they left out is broken. Rescuing them would be saying, oh, don't worry. I know you didn't mean to break that one. I'll buy you a new one. They're going to keep leaving their toys out. So you want to avoid the rescue. Letting the natural consequence kind of work, let it do its thing, is just saying, oh, that's really sad. We need to take better care of our toys. And then let it go, at least for, a month, let it go. The idea of it is the broken toy is the discipline. You don't need to pile on with more discipline. You don't need to pile onto them when they were cold. It's just knowing you were cold, next time put on a coat. You can review it with them. What did you choose? How did it work? What might you do differently next time? But it really should be about that tone. If you start to feel like you're saying, I told you so to a kid, stop. Let's say you get out in the yard and they're freezing and you go, see, it's cold. My kids? No, it's not. That would be a standoff because I just took it on as a challenge. So the idea there is just to say, what did you choose? How did it work? And see, what they've learned in that little process. This idea of natural consequences, these do kick in for a lot of kids around 3.5 years old. You can say it helps to curb the behavior. But you also want to remember, this is such a small point. You're saying what might happen. If you don't do your homework, you might get a bad grade. If you don't wear your coat, you might be cold. You don't know what's going to happen. You're just putting out there what might to help curb that behavior. My mother-in-law, love her, was the worst at this. When the girls were little, they had that living room, kitchen, dining room running track with their cousins, and they'd get running so fast. And she would say, you are going to fall. You are going to get hurt. And 20 minutes later, nobody falls, and they all kind of look at her like, because you don't know. It's not you're going to fall. It's if you run in my house, you might fall. If you're choosing this, though, you're then letting them choose that behavior, and they might fall. If you want the behavior to stop, that's a logical consequence, which we're going to talk about in the very next segment. If you run in my house, you have to sit down for 5 minutes. The logical consequences pull the parent in, or the grandparent in that case, in to curbing behavior, because then you have to have them sit for 5 minutes and you have to monitor all of that. Natural is what just might happen. Keep grabbing toys, he might not want to play with you. And then he doesn't want to play with you. And you go, that's what happens when you grab toys. It's letting the child think through, and it's letting them learn that cause and effect of their behavior and the impact on others. These natural consequences, I say them with much younger children, start to kick in somewhere around 3.5 for most kids, can be a good part and should be a good part of that discipline process for ending behaviors. If you have an outline, we're going to do the parent practice for this section now. If you don't, you can go to parentingbydrrene.com and look under YouTube outlines, I believe. This is the one for week 4, part 1. Natural consequences. So what I'm going to do now is go through these parent practice. I'm just going to read you the parent practice and give you some examples of what natural consequences might sound like. So 2 3-year-olds are pulling on a coloring book. Each is yelling that they had it first. What just might happen? It might rip. Somebody might get hurt. He might not want to play with you. Are natural consequences. When you say, if you keep pulling on that, it might rip. 2-year-olds keep pulling. They don't care. 4-year-olds, at least the one who likes the book, tends to stop pulling. They don't want it to rip. Claire's mom and dad ready for work. They put her in the living room to play. She's getting undressed, socks and shoes. Natural consequence, what just might happen. You might be cold going like that. You might be embarrassed going like that. If you're really going to take them out to the car, I think fine to say. We might be late, you might miss circle. We might be late, you might miss snack. If you're going to say we might be late, it needs to be meaningful to the child. You might miss snack. You're on your way to sports practice, 5-year-old crawling around in the back seat of the car. We might be late, you might miss practice. You might have to run laps if we're late. Your coach might not let you play in the game. It's what just might happen. 8-year-old procrastinating with homework, you've reminded them it's time to work. You might not finish your homework. You might get a bad grade. You might have to stay in for recess tomorrow. Their logical consequence, if the school says, if your homework isn't done, you have to work on it at recess, becomes your natural. You might miss recess because you're not the one enforcing that. You're letting them know what might happen at school. 3-year-old is yelling at the 5-year-old. She might not want to play with you. She might get angry. She might hit you if it happens. Those are natural, what just might happen. Now I know for several of those examples, logical consequences might make more sense, but what I want you to recognize as we go through this in the next section is that they're both available. Natural consequence, logical positive, logical negative, and you want to shake it up. If you are the parent at logical negative often, it's frustrating. It's frustrating for you. It's frustrating for them if you're always taking toys, if you're always making them sit out, and they're not learning as much. When you give these natural consequences, you're reviewing with them. Here's what might happen. So the hope is that they're building that context and they're learning from that over time.